Thank you. Thank you so much. A few years ago, I shared an essay online titled "The Crossroads of Should and Must." Unexpectedly, within 2 weeks, this very little essay was shared to over 5 million people and read by over 250,000 readers. I decided to extend the essay into a book by the same name, and after that, I got to go on and write another book with a friend. We co-authored a book together, which I'm going to talk about a little today. But to start, I wanted to rewind, and I wanted to go back to the beginning, to where it all began. It all started with a dream, a recurring dream about a white room, and it's really kind of trippy being in this actual large white room, because in the dream, I would walk into a giant warehouse space with tall white walls, a cement floor, and warehouse windows. And when I was in this dream, I would be filled with the most unbelievable sense of peace and total calm. I had this dream again and again, and one day a friend asked my friend Susie, who I eventually got to co-author our book with, she asked the question that totally flipped my life inside out. She said, "Have you ever thought about looking for this dream in real life?" No, I hadn't, but I began to wonder, okay, if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to look for a dream in real life, which is, totally a trip, where do you go? Where do you even start? I went to Craigslist, and while this wasn't exactly what I typed into the search box, this is like basically what I typed into the search box. And I had this feeling, and I want to highlight this because maybe you've had this feeling about something in your own life. I had this feeling that whatever I was looking for was somehow looking for me too. I searched, I kept searching, weeks went by, and eventually one day, I found it. It was an apartment for rent in San Francisco's Dogpatch District. There was an open house, I submitted my application, I got the apartment, and 2 weeks later, I moved in. On my very first night in the white room from my dreams, in real life, I was very excited for the peace and the calm to arrive. But it didn't. Instead, I just began to panic and flail. All of my fears began surfacing. When you're doing something new for the first time, I just began to get very nervous. And so I decided to ask the room that had called me to it. I said, "Why am I here?" And as clear as day, the room replied, "It's time to paint." I had painted all the time as a young girl. I painted into my high school years, into my college years, but somewhere along the way, I just got busy. I just started doing other things. What did you love to do as a kid? What did you love to do as a kid? Upon hearing this news, I went to the art supply store. I rebuilt my toolkit, and I went back to the white room for my dreams, and I got busy. This is the actual white room. And this was the only place, one of the only places in my life, I like to joke, where there were no case studies allowed, there were no business plans allowed, there were no right answers, there were no roadmaps, there were no maps at all. There were actually not even any answers. It was just about getting to better questions. I started working at scales that intentionally freaked me out. This was, my next door neighbor is a photographer, and this was his garbage of his photo scrim that was going out to the garbage. I grabbed it, and as I began getting comfortable with larger formatted pieces, I started moving to small. These are 100 self-portraits that I completed as a part of the global annual, the 100-Day Project. And I started sharing all of it on social media, all of it. And I quickly learned that whenever you're sharing something that's maybe just a little bit vulnerable, if you have a very cute child or baby or small fluffy white dog, just put them in front of the vulnerable objects, post away. But what I really want to talk to you about right now is this. I think this photo is really what it was all about. In this white room, in this space, I had a chance to quiet all of the voices, all of the constant chatter that was circulating around in my mind about what I should and shouldn't do, who I should and shouldn't be. And I was able to hear myself think. And one of the main reasons was that I began to cultivate a more restful mind. Around this time, I was also working long hours at a new startup in Silicon Valley. It was called Mailbox. I was the design lead, and our task was to revolutionize email for the iPhone, hopefully with the intention of giving people their time back. Maybe some of you all even used Mailbox on your phone. At the same time, I was reading a book about Picasso by Ariana Huffington. It's amazing. And in it, she talks about his life and his work, and she says, and I quote, "The more I learned about Picasso's life and the more I delved into his art, the more the two converged." Because his art was so thoroughly autobiographical, what he did was what he was. Y'all, I read that sentence over and over and over. What he did was what he was. And it led me to a question. It led me to a really good question. What if who we are and what we do becomes one and the same? What if it wasn't just about creating art with my life, but also about turning my entire life into a work of art? When we launched Mailbox, it was a wild success, and I remember thinking, wow, this is one of the highlights of my life. As so many of you all know, when you launch something that you really care about, it's an incredibly powerful experience. And at the same time, in the back of my mind, I felt like I had one foot in my painting and one foot in the startup, and I felt like everybody was losing. It was then that I came across this crossroads. I realized that I had two paths through my life. They were different, and I had to choose. Now, there are many, many ways that I am privileged. I am a white woman living in North America. One of the additional ways that I was privileged in this particular moment is that I had saved up a little bit of money where I could actually quit my job and give myself, I called it a sandbox of time, to go and make art in my studio. And after realizing that I had that little sandbox, I decided to quit, and I put in my 2 weeks' notice. What I have learned since that day is that we all arrive at this crossroads over and over again throughout our lives. And every time we do, we get to choose which way we're going to go, should or must. Should is all of the expectations, all of the obligations that we feel other people put on us. When you choose should, you know it really fast. Your body does something kind of like this. And the part that's really, really difficult and the part that's really tricky is when culture says that we should do something that deep down we know is not right for us. Must is different. Must is who you are. Must is your longings, it's your cravings, it's who you are when you are all alone with your quietest, most authentic self. 3 artists who chose must throughout their life, who made their entire life a work of art. I'd love to celebrate them today. The first is Keith Haring. Keith Haring chose must as he continued to paint about taboo topics, like the rise of the use of crack cocaine. He used his platform to say that, yes, crack is indeed whack. He then went on to shed light on the incredible, horrible AIDS crisis of the 1980s. He used his platform to talk about the need for protection, talk about things that were rapidly killing the gay community. Finally, he used his own platform, he used his own money to create posters, to create books, to create newspapers, to talk about the importance of nuclear disarmament. Keith Haring chose must with his whole life. Another artist, a painter, Van Gogh, he chose must with his life when he continued to paint the world as he saw it, even as the art world and his peers rejected his work. He wrote in a letter to his brother Theo, he said, "Who am I in the eyes of most people? An eccentric, a non-entity, a nobody. Someone who in society has no value and never will." Very well then, even if that be absolutely true, then I should like to show by my work what such an eccentric, such a nobody has in his heart. The third person who chose must is none other than the legendary Nina Simone. And I don't think I'm going to quote Nina Simone. I'm going to let her say it in her own words.
An artist's duty, as far as I'm concerned, is to reflect the times. I think that is true of painters, sculptors, poets, musicians. As far as I'm concerned, it's their choice. But I choose to reflect the times and the situations in which I find myself. That, to me, is my duty. And at this crucial time in our lives, when everything is so desperate, when every day is a matter of survival, I don't think you can help but be involved. Young people, black and white, know this. That's why they're so involved in politics. We will shape and mold this country, or it will not be molded and shaped at all anymore. So I don't think you have a choice. How can you be an artist and not reflect the times? That, to me, is the definition of an artist.
Amazing. Amazing. So if you've learned one thing so far in the talk, it's that choosing must sounds awesome. And why don't we all do it every day, right? It sounds very easy and very obvious. So why don't we choose it? What stands in the way of choosing it? This is the number one question that I have gotten around this work. What if I don't even know what my must is? Where might I find it? How do I get closer to it? What if I feel like I've lost it forever? What do I do about that? Don't worry if this is you. There's hope. Paradoxically, the more we get to know should, the closer we get to must. Should is that force, that counter force in our life that stands against even our very best intentions. And if you want to get to know must, start looking at should. I was chatting about all of this with a friend of mine one day. When he asked me a question, he said, "Are you familiar with a man named Gurdjieff?" Now, Gurdjieff was a spiritual teacher around the turn of the century, and one day he posed a question to his students. He said, if a prisoner wants to be free from prison, what is the very first thing that the prisoner needs to know? One student raised their hand and says, the prisoner needs to get to know the guard. Another student raised their hand and says, a prisoner needs to find the key. No, Gurdjieff says, if a prisoner wants to be free from prison, the very first thing the prisoner needs to know is that they're in prison. Until they know that, no escape is possible. It doesn't even make sense. If you want to get closer to your must, start looking at your shoulds. One of the exercises that I have in the Crossroads of Should and Must is this one. It's just a fill-in-the-blank, simple exercise where you can begin to look at the shoulds that perhaps you've picked up along the way. Now, since the Crossroads of Should and Must has come out, all of my work has been looking in particular at that list of shoulds. And the specific angle on that list is I have been looking at my own shoulds as a woman. Now, whether you're a man, a woman, African American, Latina, are there certain shoulds that keep you imprisoned, that keep you confined in that way? On International Women's Day this year, Susie and I very, very excitedly released our new book, Your Story is Your Power, Free Your Feminine Voice. And in it, we dive into the shoulds of being a woman. We talk about the shoulds that we feed our young girls, fairy tales that tell girls how they should and shouldn't grow up. We look at the shoulds of TV. Susie wrote, I remember watching an episode of the 1960s TV series Batman, where a disaster happened. Women took over Gotham City, and nothing could get done because they sat around looking in the mirror all day, putting on lipstick. What are the shoulds in our cultural institutions? This is a quote from The Hidden Brain. When Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg went to law school at Columbia in the 1950s, there were no women's bathrooms in the building. If nature called, you had to make a mad dash to another building that had a women's bathroom, she recalled. It was even worse if you were in the middle of an exam. We never complained. It never occurred to us to complain. I began looking at this list, and since this is, just a few small of my closest friends, maybe I'll share it with you. I began going through this list and completing it. So as a woman, I should never age. Advertising has told me that that's a very, very bad idea. As a woman, I should always obey. I should be very, very obedient. As a woman, I became very intimately familiar with this myth called the good girl myth. Some of you might also be familiar with it. As a woman, I should know better than to cross the line, rock the boat, cause a ruckus, get in other people's way. As a woman, I should not be outspoken. I probably shouldn't even talk about things like this in front of a few small friends. This was my list. This was my prison, and this was very real for me. Going down this list and getting to know these things has been the work of my life. And as I began to look at these things, one after the other, I began to hold them up to the light and to really, really look at them and ask if they're true for me and where they came from. One of the things that you might notice about this list is that it's kind of critical. As I began to look at it, I thought, oh, this is my inner critic, sitting on my shoulder and talking to me about how I should show up in the world. But as I began to look at it a little bit more closely, I realized that this list wasn't just critical. This list was actually harmful into a very specific part of me. It was the feminine parts of me. This list was actually hateful towards the feminine parts of me. And one of the things that Susie and I got to talk about in our book is a phenomenon called internalized misogyny. And what that means, cool. They were talking about it on NPR the other week, and I was like, yes, we have arrived. What internalized misogyny is when all of the misogyny that's out there in the culture, like the examples that I just shared with you, it's when as women we take it inward and we apply it to ourselves, and it begins to impact the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves as women. So, Marianne Williamson once said, feminine power isn't something we go out and acquire. It is already within us. It is something that we become willing to experience, something to admit we have. I got to a place in my life where I realized that I was so internally male identified, and it was helping me to survive very wonderfully. I'm grateful for it. And I got to a place where I thought, what if I just stopped surviving in this way? What might it look like to thrive as a woman? I knew that I needed to do some work in here. And Aikido is an amazing metaphor for how to work with our internal worlds. In Aikido, the purpose of the movements is twofold. First, it's to stop an attack. Second, and I think this is the most beautiful part, it's to be compassionate and mindful for the well-being of the attacker. Gosh. I knew that this was a really apt metaphor for how I needed to work with my internal world, and I knew that I needed to catch these shoulds in action in real time. And one day, I got a chance. I was on a date. I was on a first date, and in this date, I knew we probably weren't going to go out again. And we had tea, and he really politely asked if he could get my tea, which was unexpected and very generous, and I said yes, and I thanked him. And as we got up to leave the table, he reared his hand back and slapped me on the butt. I was shocked. Also, it hurt. I was also annoyed. I was like, this is Northern California. I got news for you. It was Northern California. That's where it happened. And all of a sudden, all of my shoulds came into play, right? Oh, don't say anything. Don't make a big scene. Don't be outspoken. Your car's right over there. Just quickly get to your car. You don't know what his deal is. Just be quiet. Shh, just get out of here, right? Right? This was my stuff. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm not going out with this guy, so I get to practice. And I thought to myself, well, I've never really done this before. Like, I don't really know what to say or how to say it. And I thought to myself, just do anything but be quiet. I don't care if you do a jumping jack or if you sing a song or tell a funny joke, just don't be silent. So I delivered, an Oscar-worthy speech to this guy, and I said, I think you want to meet a nice girl, and just so you know, if you slap her on the butt, she's not going to want to go out with you again. It was great. And I escaped, everything was fine, and surprisingly, he couldn't stop calling me after we went out. It's a good, interesting lesson. Another day, I got another opportunity to work my own Aikido. I was crossing the street in San Francisco, and there was another woman who was crossing the street coming towards me. And in that moment, I heard the dialogue that was going on in my mind about this woman's appearance. I was horrified, and I was also really excited. I was horrified because it was horrible to hear the things that I was saying, that I was judging in this other woman. And I was excited because I got to practice Aikido again. And I thought, okay, first I have to stop the attack. We're done. We're done judging other women. Let's not do that. This is harmful for everybody. And secondly, I got to practice compassion to myself. And I got to say, now you get to say something nice to the woman. And in that exact moment, the woman sneezed. And I got to say, bless you. The psychologist Carl Rogers says that when I accept myself just as I am, the curious paradox is that then I can change. Then I can change. This is one of my favorite quotes, and it continues to remind me, and it's actually why those 4 letters are behind us on the stage today. This quote is by one of my heroes, Nelson Mandela, and it's such a reminder that if we go where our judgments are, if we go where our hate is, if we follow those uncomfortable threads, it opens up doorways of possibility into a much larger, much more fulfilling life. He says, no one is born hating another person because of the color of their skin or their background or their religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. One of the organizing principles for Susie and my work is the labyrinth. How many people have walked a labyrinth before? Oh, wow, a lot, okay. A labyrinth has 2 really powerful symbols within it. The first is a spiral. We see spirals in cave paintings. It's one of the oldest symbols. And what's that all about? It's about going inside. It's about going internal. This is inner work. The second is the meander. We see the meander in rivers when they're flowing naturally. We see the meander in our own intestines. And the reason the meander is so important is because this work takes time. It takes time to digest some of these concepts. As you go through your list, and again, it's going to be different for each one of us because we're all unique. As you go through your list, you can begin to look at each item. You can begin to fill it out. You can begin to hold them up to the light, and you can start asking 3 questions. The first is, where did you come from? Where did I first pick you up? Was it an advertisement? Was it something somebody said when I was little? Where did you come from? Second, are you true for me? Are you true for who I've become in my life now? Maybe you helped me to brilliantly survive when I was 10, but I'm not 10 anymore. Are you true for me now? And finally, do I really want to keep holding on to you? Do I continue to want to make you a part of the story that I'm telling myself about myself? Do I want to keep taking you into every meeting, every project, every relationship, every day? And if the answer is no, an amazing opportunity arises. You get to practice Aikido. You get to begin to shift the story. As we continue to bring light to our shoulds, the obstacles towards must naturally begin to dissolve, and the things that stand in the way of our very best intentions, where we want to go, who we want to be, the type of world we want to be living in, they begin to dissolve. And no longer are they working against us, but now suddenly they're working for us. I've been thinking a lot about how I wanted to close today, and I'd like to tell you a story. When Susie's dad was in the hospital, he was dying. And Susie and her father had a beautiful relationship as a result of this work. And when he was in the hospital and when he was dying, he said to her, he said, Susie, I think the point of life is to love more. I think the point of life is to love more. And if there is one thing that I have learned in all of this work, it's that choosing must is to consciously choose to love more. and choosing it has been one of the greatest, most fulfilling aspects of my life. I'd like to close with a quote by Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist. "The labyrinth is thoroughly known. We have only to follow the thread of the hero path. And where we had thought to slay another, we shall slay ourselves. Where we had thought to travel outward, we will come to the center of our own existence. And where we had thought to be alone, we will be with all the world." Thank you.